launch public worship, and then there's this question of, well, we probably need some people to come to our church. I was saying to I was in a church planters meeting the other week in like a diocese organised thing, and me and Ben were there. Most of the other people were from like parish churches, and we were able to just say to them, well, it's actually just quite good being in the Antioch Network, because like you kind of forced to do evangelism because you don't have people. So it's like you need some people, so you probably better go out and get some in some way, shape or form. Before I share something, I'd love Ram to just share the story that he told me a minute ago. Is that right?
Yeah.
You do that? Yeah, go for it. That's why we do it, right?
Yeah.
We want to see people saved, people being healed, people's lives being changed. And I think that you guys were just talking a second ago about the idea that if you're a disciple, then you're going to naturally share your faith, and perhaps all of us have been connected to churches where there's not a lot of natural sharing of faith, there's not much evangelism going on, but we don't want to be churches like that. We don't want to be a network where we're just kind of happy with things as they are. We believe that Jesus has given us this gospel that needs sharing, right? So you've got this already, right? The paper, there's some spare ones at the back. There's loads of good stuff. There's about 15 or 16 points on there that from John. As is traditional, I won't follow it exactly, but we're going to refer to it at times. And it's if you haven't read it already, then do go through it. Really good stuff. I wanted to start by talking about our motivation for evangelism. So we said already, like, at its best, the fact that we're small churches is like a good motivation. It's like a good reminder that we need to be reaching out and encouraging more people to come to know Jesus. At its worst, we can become like desperate. Right? It's like we need some people, and we can then end up with slightly wonky motivations for evangelism. So I just wanted to speak into that a little bit. First thing to say is, like, I've definitely been there. Like, you know, our journey over the last few years and in other churches I've been part of, like, I'm really familiar with those feelings of, like, desperate for people to join what we're doing, because otherwise, like, you don't want it to, like, fail, do you? You want things to go well. You want to be in a thriving church. So the best question to ask ourselves at this stage, I reckon, is, like, why do I want people to come to my church? Is it to make me feel better? Or is it for the glory of Jesus and for the people who need him? Now, don't get me wrong, like, we're always going to have mixed motives, aren't we, when we do anything connected with church? So, like, it's worth acknowledging that, and because otherwise, you know, if we waited for the purest of motives to do church and evangelism, like, we'd be waiting forever. But there's definitely a sense that we can get it wrong. We can be doing this for the wrong reasons. Why is that a problem? You know, we might kind of say, well, by hook or by crook, it's good that people come in, and there's, you know, some truth in that. But I think there's a few reasons why it's bad to be doing evangelism for the wrong reasons. One, like, we've got to think about the culture we're setting in our church, right? If we as the main leader perhaps have a sort of an anxiety about us, a desperation for people to just, like, be bums on seats, then that's going to seep into our teams, isn't it? And we're going to have a church full of, like, anxious people who aren't resting in the grace and power of God. And we're also not really properly, so, you know, what's the Great Commission? It's go into all the world and make disciples. Like, we're not actually making disciples, are we? We might maybe convince people that they should pray a sinner's prayer or whatever, but we're not discipling people into following the Jesus who says, my yoke is easy, my burden is light.
Yeah.
Come to me, all who are weary. If we're like a church of like tense, desperate people who are just like want people to come and join us because we feel like a bit lonely, like that's not good, is it? That's
Should be some sort of way they can follow it up. Like if you give a leaflet, have a number so that people if they're really interested can ring you back.
Yeah, absolutely.
Ask questions.
Yeah, there's
if
loads
they
of.
don't have any follow-up.
Yeah.
They're just left to their own devices.
Yeah,
aren't they?
really good point. Yeah, you don't. We talk about cold contact evangelism of various sorts, whether it's door knocking on the street, but you want to have an idea in your mind how what's going to be the next step for people for sure. Yeah. So the method matters, right? Like the heart that we have behind it matters, and I think it's also not going to be good for us. Like we're quickly gonna just go crazy, burn out, whatever. Like if our motivation is not just coming from a place of resting in Jesus and his love for us, and our evangelism isn't a response to what he's done for us, we're not leading people out of like the grace that we've been shown. Like that's the only kind of sustainable motivation for us as leaders. We're not going to last long if we have some other less healthy motivation. I suppose, to put it quite starkly as well, to lead a church is a great responsibility and privilege as well, isn't it? And if we will one day stand before the Lord and give account for how we've done it, and I don't want to say, hey God, I kind of did it for me. That seems like an awkward conversation. So part of, like, before anything really, when we're talking about reaching the area that the Lord's called us to, it's about our heart, as all of this stuff is. So we're going to be all agreed on that, right? But it's worth saying. So then the question is like, well, how are we going to do it? How do we keep relying on the power of Jesus? How do we keep striving to make his name great? Point 5 in the quick paper is, I think really nails this. It talks about how everything you do is worship. Everything you do is worship. So we want to be praying before we do any kind of outreach, whatever that might be. We want to discipline ourselves to frame everything in worship and in prayer. And that's why, like, when we come together and train, like we worship and we pray together. It's not just a like, how are we going to do this task better? There's an encounter to the learning that we're doing today, and there should be an encounter and a sense of response when we're living this stuff out as well. Obviously, like, our emotions are going to be going up and down as we're striving to lead churches that are reaching out to people.
Yeah.
But under it all should not be like an anxiety. It should be a joy, shouldn't it?
That's
And
right.
that joy comes from spending time with the Lord, of being grounded in him. And it's also going to be our job as the leader, as we've kind of hinted already, to keep other people's motivations on track as well. Like, we're going to be leading all sorts of people. They'll be different in different churches, different teams. You'll have the kind of incorrigible evangelists who like won't hear about doing anything apart from like standing on a street corner, like shouting at people. I exaggerate, but you know what I mean? There are those type of people who are just like, we've got to get on with it. We've got to do it now. What are we waiting for? And maybe sometimes with those people, we need to just kind of pull them in a little bit and help them rest in Jesus a bit and trust in him, and see maybe that there might be other ways to do it as well. Not that like being loud and out there is wrong by any stretch of imagination, but maybe there's some learning that they need to do about how to bring others along with the task who are not such natural outgoing evangelists in that kind of way. Then you'll probably in your team have people who are maybe really pastorally motivated, and they're kind of worrying the whole time, well, maybe not worrying, but they're thinking the whole time about how are people feeling when we share the gospel with them? What kind of impression are we making on our community? Like that's often something that we can be quite conscious of in estate churches where you have like a real defined community where like everyone sort of knows everyone. There's like gossipy Facebook groups and all that kind of stuff. And so as a church, you do need to think like, what kind of impression am I making in this community?
The more time we spend with the Lord, the more fruitful we'll be. And people will see the fruit.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And we want part of that fruit to be that we have favour in our communities, that people, when they hear the name of your church, they think well of us, right? And some people in our teams are going to be really thinking about that, and maybe they'll say, oh, we shouldn't do it like that because people would think bad of us or whatever, and maybe they need to be told, well, we're here for the audience of one, as we were talking about before, and some people might not like what we do, but we're going to do it anyway because we're doing it for Jesus and people need to hear about him. So just a couple of examples, but there's different types of people who we might have to, as leaders, be aware of how we can keep them like pointing in the right direction. Like it's always going to be worth listening to people, isn't it? Like, because we're not going to see everything. We might have missed something. Someone might point something out to us in terms of our approach to outreach that we haven't thought of. But part of the job as the main leader is to have confidence in the call that God has given us, and sort of stand our ground a bit and say, hey, it's my job to lead us, and we're going in this direction, and that can take a bit of practice because sometimes we can be a bit reluctant to do that, but generally we want to be imbuing our teams with confidence that God's called the right person to lead, and that we're able to hold that. So all that to say, evangelism is not about making a name for ourselves. It's about lifting the name of Jesus. It's not just about like getting people into church because it'll make us feel better if there's more people there on a Sunday. It's about loving Jesus and loving people, isn't it? We do it for those reasons. Like, when I read the Gospels, I'm struck, like it's quite marked how much Jesus is motivated by love for people, isn't it? Yeah. I was reading Feeding the 5,000 the other day, Mark 7, and it says he had compassion on the people because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and that's a good kind of filter to run our thoughts through, right? When we're out doing maybe street evangelism or knocking on doors or running an alpha course, am I doing this because of the compassion that Jesus has put in my heart for these people? Or am I doing it for another reason? Because actually, in the long run, without it coming from those motivations, our evangelism long term won't be effective or sustainable in making disciples who are fit for or equipped to follow Jesus for the long haul. That thing of like, unless they know that you care, they won't care what you know. I think that's kind of true. It's a bit of a cliche, but it's kind of true. Certainly, we've seen that over the last few years in our community. It's the kind of community that wants to see that people are committed to it, wants to see that you care, is willing to trust you if they see those things, but is probably not willing to listen to you if you're just kind of, there for out for you or there for just a short time or whatever it might be. It doesn't mean that as we go about evangelism, we have to be like best friends with everyone. I guess we don't even have to like everyone. We can't like everyone often. But loving people's different than liking everyone, isn't it? Loving people's different than being best friends with everyone. Yeah. So our food bank outreach at Grace Church is a good example. It's actually been a really successful way for us to show our community that we care. And we've seen as well that increasing numbers of people are coming on a Sunday and responding to Jesus through that way, because it's just like dead easy. They're feeding me, I see that they care. And then quite often, like quite natural conversations can come up from that around faith, which is really exciting. And I think we've clearly seen that feeling loved helps people be receptive to the gospel. Like it breaks down barriers, right? Not that we are trying to kind of manipulate people, and there's a kind of fine line to tread there with this. Some local ministers that I've spoken to are really like against any kind of follow-up evangelism that's linked to food banks, because they see it as like exploitation. You know, like people are coming for food and you're sort of saying have a sandwich if you have Jesus kind of thing.
Do you ever put leaflets in the bag which has got the food they're collecting?
What we try and do is just, I wouldn't say we have a exact, like, we always do it this way. We try and be flexible and respond to the particular person and the particular situation and what seems appropriate and right in our spirit as we kind of offer it to the Lord, and offer up those people in prayer to Him as well. And that's, so there's not kind of an exact science to it, as in my experience over the last year or so doing the food bank. And sometimes it doesn't feel appropriate to. Sometimes it's just like take the food and that's fine. Sometimes, like we just have a sense that there's a conversation that like we could offer to pray. There's something that we could invite someone to. It basically works as just a really great way to meet people, and these are people who happen to be in a fair amount of need, and if you can go into it in a prayerful way, then God's going to give you opportunities to speak into their lives. That's kind of how things have gone for us. And it makes me sad when I think that some people don't take those opportunities because they're fearful that that it might be perceived in the wrong way, or they think it's exploitation. Because, like, if we think about it, the greater need that people have is Jesus, even than food, right? So it's a real shame if churches shy away from sharing our faith, and that.
I think if we have this genuine love for those people, we should share the best thing.
Yes.
Yeah, the best thing in Jesus, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So. Absolutely. Yeah. And I wonder, maybe for those people who object to that kind of thing, whether it's to do with they haven't maybe been trained in doing it sensitively with the Holy Spirit. Like, you can't go into it with just I will say this thing to every person, and because then you could end up being insensitive, and but amazing opportunities. And actually, we found with our leadership team, one of the things that we found, because we were a small team, felt like it'd be a great way of connecting more in the community, doing food bank, but we were lacking the people from within our church we were lacking the numbers to be able to help out to make Food Bank happen. So just had to like cast the net a little wider and reach out to various people that we'd met in the community who weren't necessarily Christians and say, hey, do you want to help us run a food bank? And now some of them have started coming to church. So that's really exciting as well, because there's a chance there for people to see what you're like, right, and to gain trust. So this a mother and daughter who had some church history, but they weren't going to church, and just before Christmas, the daughter, who's 14, was rushed to hospital with a brain tumour. And the mum, who'd been volunteering at Food Bank, just turns up at our house like in absolute bits. And so I was able to pray with her, and she, one of the things actually, we had Zephaniah 3:17 earlier, didn't we? She said, it's amazing, like I have, like, what happens when you're in crisis? You pray, don't you? She was like, I've been praying, and I woke up this morning and I just had the numbers 317 in my mind, and I was like, I don't know where it's come from, and so I googled it, as you do. So she googled 317, and up comes Zephaniah 3:17, and she just found it amazingly like encouraging. So the two of them now come every Sunday. Long story short, and they also managed to bring the dad the other week as well, who hasn't got a kind of background of church going in his history. So that's been really exciting.
Can I just say as well, that overlaps with something Ben and John often talk about, which is that if you only engage people with extremely high needs and bring them into the church, the chances are the launch team, the planting team, the core team, whatever, will get to a point where they're just so exhausted, they don't feel like they can have a bad week, where they need to be prayed for, and they feel on duty every time. And that's actually creates a sort of client service provider relationship, which is not healthy. So the fact that you guys have been able to bring in people who are helpers as well as, for want of a better phrase, clients, it's more likely to be a sustainable pattern than of reaching people, isn't it? That it's people from different backgrounds,